It's my pleasure to welcome Pratyusha, who's a sixth-year graduate student at MIT. She's extremely interdisciplinary. Her advisors are spanning both NLP, vision, robotics, and she's also going to be talking to us about sperm whale human communication, which is kind of exciting. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shyam. So good afternoon, everyone. Today's talk is going to be about experimental methods and algorithms that help us both understand and discover and engineer the computation underlying large intelligent agents. And we're going to be looking at both biological organisms as well as AI systems. So, starting out, across the tree of life, starting with the simplest to the most complex organism, every organism can perceive their environment and can act to cause changes to it. Now, clearly, some animals on the spectrum exhibit more sophisticated behaviors than others. So where do the differences lie? In scale, yes, as we go from left to right, animal systems become multicellular and they have more complex nervous systems. But importantly, the differences also lie in structure. For example, one thing to note is that whales have more neurons than humans do, and C. elegans has 250 times more neurons per unit body mass than humans do. So scale, however you measure it, is absolutely essential, but by itself, it's insufficient. So let's also add two engineered systems to the spectrum. Robotic systems that can perceive and act in the world, and language models that have language as both the input and the output. Now, we want to be able to build systems that exhibit properties like humans or other animal systems. So there's the important and topical question of what do we even build in, right? Scale, structure, what is it? So let's look at this slightly differently. So all of these systems, biological and artificial, lie somewhere along these two axes of scale and structure. Currently in computer science and in biology, there are two schools of thought. So the first school believes that what you need are inductive biases that capture the essence of the domains that these systems operate in, and the more structure you build in, more kinds of intelligent behaviors emerge. The second school of thought, the scale school, believes that by taking simpler ideas, building simple models, adding in more parameters, and throwing in more data, these models will learn everything necessary through stochastic gradient descent. Now, a popular hypothesis for this is one by Rich Sutton, where he suggests that simple models trained at scale outperform boutique specialized systems. But the question really is, at what scale and for what kinds of structures? So to get to an answer to this question, I look at existing intelligent agents, understand their computational underpinnings, and use these insights to build AI systems. And today, I'll be going over experiments that investigate this question with some of these systems. So part of the structure in human cognition comes from language. Language is a communicative tool, but importantly, it's also a cognitive tool, with Chomsky even saying that 99% of why language exists and came into being is to kind of enable this internal computation in our brains, and only 1% of it is external. Now, while you may or may not agree with Chomsky's exact split, we cannot deny that language interacts with other components in our brain, structures our thought, reasoning, and enables a range of intelligent behaviors. It's language and language-like structures that I find most interesting. Compositional, hierarchical, productive. So the structures I'll be talking about today will be those induced by or given by language, natural or not, and how they connect to different external behaviors that some of these systems exhibit. So part of this talk will look at understanding some of these large, complex systems, and the other will look at how we can use what we've learned to build better AI systems. And one running theme in this talk will be how science can inform the practice of deep learning, and how we can learn to engineer the right structures informed by a deeper scientific understanding of existing intelligent systems. So today, first, we're going to look at language models that are trained on natural language data at scale and understand the types of structures or space of functions or solutions they learn intrinsically, and how a deeper understanding of these structures can help us, can be used to improve their empirical generalization. We will then look at sperm whales, a system where we only have access to the outputs of the system, and ask what do these outputs reveal about the system's underlying structure, and what kinds of social behaviors does it drive? And finally, we will very quickly look at how we can build in some of these language-like structures into robotic systems or embodied systems and see how this can enable better long-horizon reasoning and planning in these systems, while also being very data efficient. OK, so with that, let's start with our first system, which is language models. So a large language model these days is typically made of these transformer blocks and is trained on the task of next token prediction. So given a span of words like this, for every token, the model outputs the probability distribution of the next token over all possible tokens. Right? So what we want to do here is understand what we can say about the function that's being learned underneath. So to understand the learned solution in a language model, one thing people do oftentimes is probe the model's representation for a select set of properties. So while this tells you only one thing at a time, it also tells you the information present in the representation, but very little about how the underlying computation of the model is itself organized. Okay, so one way in which we are going to work towards understanding a language model is to perform an intervention on a part of the network. And we're going to then measure how this intervention affects the behavior of the model. Okay? And first, let's look at what happens when we systematically approximate the weight matrices in a model. And following that, we're going to once again prompt the model with the same question and measure how the answer of the model changes. Are the errors systematic in any way? And how does the representation of this model change? All right? So while there are many different ways of approximating the weight matrices in a model, we're going to replace them with their low-rank approximation. Okay, so to do the low-rank approximation of a matrix, we're going to do SVD and keep only the top k components. Additionally, like one more thing, we're going to do this selectively across different layer numbers and layer types in the model. So just one matrix at a time. We call this operation laser, which stands for layer selective rank reduction. So in summary, to perform a single laser intervention, one has to make three choices. First is what layer to select. Second is what type of matrix in that layer to select. And third, how much should this matrix be reduced by? So with that, let's start with a 6 billion parameter model called GPT-J and see what happens on a question answering task called counterfact. And let's just start with a single MLP matrix in the last layer of this transformer. So what would you expect? Right? As you throw out more information, like from this matrix, how would you expect the accuracy of the model on this task to look like? Yes, exactly. So perhaps one might expect that with increasing amounts of rank reduction, the accuracy of the model on the task should worsen, right? After all, we're approximating learned matrices in this model. However, we saw that the rank reduction in this MLP weight matrix in the final layer led to an improvement in the accuracy of the model. And here, by 8 percentage points on question answering accuracy. Okay, and the point with the highest accuracy corresponded to when we reduced the rank of this matrix from 4,096 all the way to 20, which is a 99.5% reduction. And this is much beyond the effective rank of this matrix. So next, we wanted to see if the effect of laser was uniform across the different layers in this model. And here's another plot of how the model's loss on the data set changes as lasers performed at different layers. Okay, so y-axis is loss, x-axis is layer number. The black dashed line corresponds to the base model. And in the colors, like a darker color corresponds to a more severe reduction. So what you can see here is that the positive effect of laser is predominantly observed in the later layers in the model. So now that we see this interesting phenomenon, can we use this for model selection? Okay, so given a pre-trained model, we're going to search for the optimal set of hyperparameters on the validation set and report the performance of the model on the test set. And here we're going to look at how much of this model's performance can be improved by simply throwing out information and by performing a single laser intervention. So just changing one matrix in the model and doing nothing else. And we see that laser shows improvements on data sets evaluating language model reasoning, world knowledge, factuality, and a lot more. And it also does so for language models of different sizes. The metric reported here is accuracy. And in red, I've highlighted cases where laser shows an improvement of at least 5 percentage points. And what you can see here is several of these improvements are actually quite big, right, with nearly up to 30 percentage point improvement on accuracy just by doing this operation on a single matrix. Laser also has the advantage of reducing the memory footprint of the model, discarding over 50% of the components of the matrix at times. And when performed concurrently on multiple layers, it further improves the model's performance beyond improvements that you can see with its application on a single layer. Here's another task, right? So is this true only for language models, or does this also hold outside of language modeling? Right? And we see that these results hold outside of the text domain on policy learning tasks. So here's Sokoban, a game that requires planning over multiple time steps to move all these boxes to their target locations. And we see that a transformer-based policy trained on this task, we train a transformer policy trained on this task and then do laser post-training. And we see both an improvement in the average return as well as the accuracy. So now to understand laser a bit better, we wanted to understand what kinds of information is it recovering. So we study this in the context of GPT-J, for which the original pre-training data is available, the PILE data set, and for counterfact, which has these facts organized as entity relation answer triples. So what this lets you do is that for every data point in the counterfact, we can search through the 1 terabyte of the PILE data set, which is the pre-training corpus, for data points where the entity and answer co-occurred. Right? So this lets you kind of compute the frequency distribution of how often different test facts occurred in the training data. And for laser, we find that the largest boost in performance occurs for low frequency samples or information that's less frequently presented in the training data. And this is particularly interesting because less frequently presented information is also oftentimes the hardest to learn. Another question you can ask is, what is it that the higher ordered components are even storing in the first place, right? So to understand this, unlike approximating the matrix with just its lower ordered components, like in the case of laser, we approximate it with its higher ordered components. And we find that this causes the model to return an incorrect answer, but of the correct type. Okay, so like in this case, it's returning French instead of Dutch. But it's also not just incorrect answers of the correct type. A lot of times, the model also ends up returning high-frequency words. So lots of people are lasering models, and there were 100 lasered models on Hugging Face alone. And there's a bunch of follow-up work from different groups showing how laser could be used for principal compression, for debiasing models, for efficient fine-tuning, and also some theoretical work on understanding why laser works in the first place. So while the focus of this research was on the science, it's useful to think about these results in another way. So let's say we have the following 3 axes. Okay, so performance, compression, and compute. Neural network compression methods like magnitude-based pruning to find the winning lottery tickets, or quantization or binarization, often find models that are performance preserving and are compressed. So at best, you get a model that does just as well as the base model. Right? And typically, this pruning is guided by ensuring the least change in loss. Okay, so using a little bit of additional compute. Fine-tuning methods have varying computational requirements, and they can improve the performance of your model. With laser, with only a few forward passes, no gradients, you can both compress as well as improve the performance of your model, opening up a different way to update your model on this Pareto frontier. From the lottery ticket hypothesis, we know that there are smaller neural networks within larger networks. But with laser, we now know that they're both smaller and better neural networks within larger networks. So in conclusion, we demonstrate that it's possible to simultaneously enhance the task performance of a pre-trained language model while reducing its size in a gradient-free way. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away, is that they're smaller and better neural networks within larger networks. Okay, so we saw that, yes?
Does this observation hold mostly for question answering tasks, but also for reasoning tasks as well?
Yes, so it also holds for reasoning tasks. So some of the benchmarks that we use, so for example, epistemic reasoning is a classical reasoning task. So the model is required to make entailment judgments. So it also ends up working there. Yeah, and I think we also had like other data sets like truthful, QA, and other. So they were mostly question answering tasks, but also measure different things. So like the truthfulness of your model or the bias in models. So it's a mix of different tasks. Okay, so we saw that imposing low-rank structure post-training in models dramatically improved the performance of these models post-training, right? But before moving on to the next section on whales, I also want to tell you a little bit about a different kind of structure that could also improve generalization in models. And to motivate that structure, let me take an example, okay? So if I say that the red apple is on the table, how does your mind put together the meaning of the sentence? There's overwhelming evidence from developmental psychology, formal linguistics, and neuroscience that humans compute the meaning of a sentence in this bottom-up tree-shaped manner, where the meaning of the sentence is generated by combining the meanings of the parts of the sentence. Okay, and this is exactly the ability that allows you to generalize to sentences with longer lengths, with more nested structures, and also to novel composition of words. Right? So for example, if I say there is a pink elephant sitting on a stool here and reading a book and laughing, you've probably never heard that sentence before, but you had no difficulty kind of creating a picture in your brain of exactly what I was referring to. Right? But there's a tension between compositional accounts of language understanding, which rely on the strictly bottom-up process, and the success of neural language models, like transformer models, that can route information arbitrarily across its inputs. So the question is, how do transformers compute the meaning of a sentence? So when trained on language data, do transformers learn some arbitrary computation that utilizes the full capacity of the architecture? Or are they learning simpler tree-like computations hypothesized to underlie compositional meaning systems like the human language? So really the question in one line is, are transformers implementing tree-structured computations internally? And once again, this is a different notion from probing for syntax, which simply tries to figure out if information about syntax is present in the representations of the model, and not if the computation in the model is itself organized according to trees. So one way in which you could think about an answer to this question is the following. So let's say you have this blue region that represents the space of all possible contextual encoders, which is every possible parameterization of a transformer model. And now let's say you have this red region that represents a more restricted class of functions, binary branching tree-structured computations. So given a transformer model F, what we want to do is find its tree projection, which is the binary branching tree-structured representation that best approximates F's outputs on a given set of strings. And we call the error incurred in doing so the tree structuredness of F. So at a high level, our proposed method functionally projects transformer models into the space of all tree-structured computations, and it does so by doing an implicit search over the joint space of all possible tree-structured computations and all possible parameterizations of these tree-structured computations. And as clearly some of you might be thinking, the search is intractable. So to overcome this intractable search problem, we propose an efficient algorithm inspired by ideas from classical constituency parsing that allows us to do this in polynomial time. And while I'll not be talking about the details of this algorithm today, I'm happy to talk to you about this to people interested after the talk. So what this algorithm lets you do is that it lets you compute a score that can tell you how tree-like the internal computation of a model is. Okay? And the way in which we compute the score, it ends up being inversely proportional to the approximation error. So a higher tree score means that the model is becoming more tree-like. So now that we have this way to project transformers into the space of all possible tree-structured computations, what does the score tell us? Yes?
Should we be at all concerned that some trees are very bushy and others are very linear? Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems to me that just distance to some tree structure seems to ignore the fact that some trees are more tree-y than other trees.
Yes, so we're only looking at the approximation error between the transformer model and binary branching tree-structured representations.
Oh, so they really have to be fully, okay.
Yes, yes.
We don't care how deep they are, but they have to be binary.
Exactly, binary branching tree-structured computations, and not topologically tree structures, but tree-structured computations. Okay, so functionally tree-like. Okay, So first, in the course of training, we find that transformers become increasingly tree-like. Second, most of the times, the models recover gold syntax trees. That is, the computation is roughly guided by notions of syntax. So what this lets you do is it lets you do unsupervised parsing. And most interestingly, for models with identical IID accuracy, tree-likeness is a better predictor of compositional generalization. And in the same vein, I want to tell you about one more experiment. So many prior works had questioned if transformers have the right inductive bias for tasks designed to pick out models that require building latent hierarchical structures. So some of these papers constructed data sets where both a hierarchical rule as well as the non-hierarchical rule would equally well fit, would perfectly fit the training set, but only if the model picked up the hierarchical rule would it generalize out of distribution. And other papers showed that transformers showed extremely poor generalization performance on these tasks. Therefore, these experiments showed that IID validation accuracy was not a good measure of compositional generalization, or not a good proxy measure or a good predictor of compositional generalization. So for these very same tasks, we decided to train transformers. But then at the same time, we kept track of their tree score. And then what we saw was actually quite surprising. We saw for these training runs, the tree score continued to improve long after validation accuracy had saturated. And on data sets where prior work reported generalization accuracies below 30%, simply by training for longer, we saw that the mean accuracy across random seeds reached over 80%, and some of the seeds achieved near perfect generalization. So it was tree projections that let us discover this phenomenon that we call structural grokking. And while such a behavior was previously observed for toy arithmetic tasks, we were the first to discover it for transformer language models trained on text. So to kind of summarize this, we proposed a technique that allowed us to functionally project transformer models into the space of tree-structured computations. And we find that as transformers become more tree-like, it implies that they're making the right independence assumptions over their inputs. And without needing an OOD test set, this allowed us to say how effectively the model will generalize out of distribution and compositionally. So to kind of wrap up part one, we saw that in both of these cases, there are smaller transformers within larger transformers. And in the case of laser, there were not only smaller transformers, but better transformers within larger transformer models. And we saw how a better understanding of how the computation within models is organized helped us improve their empirical generalization. Okay, so in the first part, I proposed techniques that allow us to understand and improve complex AI models by approximating them with these simpler surrogate models. Now, could we use a similar approach to understand complex biological agents, right? A system where we only have black box access to the outputs of the system. And my window into the computation of the minds of animals is going to be through their externalized communication and behavior. And I study this in the context of sperm whales. What is the complexity of their communication, and how does it drive a range of intelligent behaviors? At this point, some of you might be wondering, why study animal communication? After all, human language is considered to be special and different, but there is a bit of a problem. We do not even understand the communication of most other animals. And a lot of animal studies are actually based on tests done in captivity. But complex communication systems are born out of the need to solve complex problems that are likely to rise in the wild. And what can look like a complex problem can look very different from one species to another in their ecological niches. Realizing that whales have songs initiated an international ban on whaling. And I believe that a deeper understanding of animals can change our perspective as well as treatment towards them. Also, working towards a computational solution to this problem poses many interesting technical questions, some of which I'll be going over today. But still, why study sperm whales? You could study some terrestrial animals or animals where you had easier access, right? So sperm whales are animals with the largest brains to have ever existed on the planet, and they've had it for 16 million years. They live in complex matriarchal societies where the members of the family coordinate hunting, they take turns babysitting each other's young ones, and all of this in complete darkness, like 600 meters under the water. And they also socialize for extended periods of time. And while coordinating in complete darkness, they exchange long sequences of sounds with one another. So we know that they're communicating. What we do not know is how is it that they're doing and what is it that they're talking about. And that's what we've set out to find. So sperm whales sound something like this. And the communication calls are believed to be made of these tiny packets of clicks that are called coders. And past research had identified around 21 discrete coder types in the sperm whales in the Caribbean. But almost everything else about the sperm whale communication system, including questions about its structure and information carrying capacity, remained unknown. But how could these animals exhibit such complex group behaviors on one hand, but have such a limited communication system with just a small fixed set of 21 call types? Something did not add up. So the first thing we did was we changed how we looked at this data. And let me explain one approach. So instead of plotting clicks in time this way, we're going to plot them along two axes. On the x-axis, the position of the dot will represent the time the click was made at. And on the y-axis, how long after the first click in the coder was the click produced. Let's do this for other clicks. And if we do the same thing for other whales in the conversation, each represented by a different color, you're going to see something like this. Right? So what you've done is taken the call and turned it over on its head. And let's also connect calls made by the same whale with lines. So this will help us visually track how their calls change over time. We call this plotting style the exchange plot. A 1-minute exchange visualized this way started to look like this. And a 30-minute exchange between multiple whales started to look like this. The exchange plot highlighted a lot of structure in the calls that was previously just not known. And in particular, we saw two completely new ways in which the whales were changing their calls that had not been discovered. So first, we saw that whales were gradually stretching and shrinking their calls at nearly the order of 100 milliseconds. And that this extremely delicate modulation of the duration in the calls was being perceived as well as imitated by other speakers in the exchange, even when they were producing completely different calls. So the orange whale is producing a 1, 2, 3, 4 click call, and the blue whale is producing a 5-click call. And despite producing different calls, they're able to match each other's fine-grained changes in duration. So if it really was noise and imperceptible to a listener, how could it be imitated? And we call this gradual variation rubato. Another thing we saw was how the whales would suffix their calls with these extra clicks, while keeping the rest of their call nearly identical to the previous one. And these happen to occur at critical points of turn change. So we call this extra click the ornament. Okay? And also, just from these plots, you can already tell that the whales can vary one feature while keeping the other one constant. So they kind of exercise this independent control over these features. So more in-depth analysis of the sounds in the data set show that the coders are not defined by a small fixed set of 21 call types, but instead formed a combinatorial coding system, where every coder is created by sampling from a set of these features, each of which could be independently varied, like an alphabet. So what are these features? So first is the tempo, and we found that the overall duration of the coders cluster around a few sets of discrete values, and precisely just these 5 different values. The second is the relative spacing of the clicks with respect to one another, which we call rhythm. And this clustered into 18 different types. And these are some more examples of rhythm. The next is the ornament, or the extra click that I talked about. And we saw that structurally, the ornamented calls had an atypical interclick interval distribution. And knocking off this extra click caused the rest of the call to align better with known rhythmic types. And functionally, we saw that the ornaments occurred at critical points of turn change. And here are some more examples. And finally, it's rubato, which is the smooth variation in the duration of the calls. Structurally, we saw that the rubato accumulated over time. And functionally, the rubato was being imitated. And here are some more examples. So what we saw was that the resulting set of individual calls had significantly higher information carrying capacity, showing that the sperm whale communication system was significantly more expressive than what was previously believed. One of the features that allows human language to express an infinite space of complex meanings is this property known as duality of patterning. It's how a set of base set of meaningless elements or phonemes get sequenced together to form words that can in turn be sequenced together to form sentences to communicate about an infinite space of meanings. Similarly, its use by sperm whales shows that it's not uniquely human and can arise from dramatically different physiological, social, and ecological pressures. And these results open up the possibility that the sperm whale communication system might provide our first example of that phenomenon in another species. This work also became part of public discourse, and it was covered in the New York Times and the National Geographic magazine. And I particularly enjoyed this piece of reporting, which is a podcast on The Daily, and it does a wonderful job situating what this means in the context of understanding animal communication more broadly. Okay, so this finding gave us a way to go from whale calls to the alphabet or the informative features of their calls, right? But we still have no idea how the whales sequence these calls or what is it that they're choosing to communicate about. So to understand the difficulty of this problem, let's take a step back. So let's say we have the following set of discrete characters from an alien broadcast, okay? So the broadcast is simple. You have no difficulty identifying structure in these calls. But clearly, as the broadcast becomes more involved, finding patterns in these data sets becomes incredibly hard for scientists. So one thing modern machine learning tools are really good at is their ability to effectively fit to and find patterns in this high-dimensional, noisy, sequential data, sometimes even before humans have identified meaningful features. And we have a similar situation with the whales. So like a human language model that is trained to output likely completions of text, similarly, we can train a language model on whale text to give us likely completions of their calls. However, this is still not a complete solution, right? While the language model can tell you likely outputs given inputs, it still doesn't tell you anything concrete about the underlying structure of this communication system or anything precise about it, right? So while understanding how language models might be predicting a certain sequence of outputs over another might still be challenging, we can already start to learn from what they're predicting and how that changes in response to changing the input. So by systematically manipulating the data that the model gets trained on and measuring the impact of these manipulations on the model's predictive power, we can already start to identify what aspects of the call carry information about future calls, as well as we could train these machine learning models to map to behavior to understand the function of these calls. So using these methods, we show that these models can be used not just for prediction, but as tools to test out different hypotheses and make discoveries about these unknown communication systems, or in general, unknown biological systems. And our experiments resulted in 4 findings. So first, let's talk about the complexity in the exchange structure. We find that the sperm whale vocalizations exhibit order dependence on calls up to nearly 30 seconds in the past. And a communication system with these properties demonstrates the animal's ability to maintain these more structured relationships over longer time horizons. Second, we saw that sperm whales exhibit a lot of these different behaviors or activity. So for example, they go on these really long, deep foraging dives that last about over 45 minutes. But given a set of calls, can we predict what the whale might be doing right now, or if it's going to dive shortly after? And we find that both current as well as future behavioral states are predictable from calls alone. So in principle, you could drop a microphone in the water, and without even seeing what the whales are doing, get a sense of what they're doing right now, or if they're going to dive shortly after. And this is a very useful tool for ecologists. And interestingly, third, it's not the individual calls that are unique in different behavioral contexts. The same call can be produced in multiple different contexts, but how the calls get strung together is what gives them their unique structure across these different behavioral contexts. And here are some examples of that. And finally, by inspecting the model's predictions, we identify a specific multi-coda motif that is predictive of future diving when made by multiple whales present in the exchange. So it's like a let's dive coda structure. And these experiments provided the first evidence that the sperm whale vocalizations exhibit long-range structure above a single coda level, and the first evidence that the structure encodes information about current behavior and is potentially used to coordinate some of these future behaviors. And more generally, our work offers a framework for using tools of AI, not just to build predictive models of complex biological systems, but as tools to test out different hypotheses about unknown communication systems or unknown biological systems, while also making fewer assumptions about it. So in conclusion, I discovered that the sperm whale communication system is a combinatorial coding system whose structure is utilized to express and coordinate complex future behaviors. OK, so to take stock of things so far, I'd like to frame how we've been looking at things along these three questions. So first is, what is the structure? Second is, where does the structure come from? And third, what does it let the system do? We saw that language models discover selectively low-rank or tree-shaped computations when trained on internet-scale data, and further enforcing the structure post-training improves their empirical generalization. We saw that whales developed a combinatorial communication system optimized by evolution, and this allowed the system to increase its expressivity despite being limited by a simple vocal apparatus. Now, in the case of robots, we want them to generalize compositionally to arbitrary objects and environments, but collecting even a fraction of internet-scale data is difficult, and we cannot wait for evolution. So the structure really needs to be built in to make learning at relatively smaller data scales more tractable. So while we, yes.
If you don't mind, I think it's a good time for this question. It's a very general question, and we don't have to answer it now. But are we assuming that the whale's language is uniform across the species? Because, of course, this is not true for humans.
Yes. It's also not true for whales. Turns out they have dialects, and depending on which ocean you go to, they speak a completely different dialect of whale speak, or like completely different set of symbol repertoire. And we were studying whales in a particular ocean, and the data was collected just from these whales. Okay. So we've been looking at structures that emerge at scale with language models and whales, and how in the case of language models, imposing the structure post-training led to improvements in their empirical generalization. But now when we don't have scale on our side, what kinds of structures can help? So whales generated complex messages by structuring simpler calls into sequences, and this enabled more sophisticated group behaviors. This suggests that communication not only supports complex group behaviors, but may also push individuals to exhibit increasingly sophisticated behaviors. Now, could this understanding inform approaches to developing embodied systems with stronger combinatorial reasoning capabilities to enable complex behaviors? So what should we build into these systems? So we're going to look at how building a latent language of thought can enable robotic systems to generalize compositionally. But before that, what do we even want embodied systems to do? One may want to be able to make an abstract request such as this one, and have the robot make sense of all the different parts of the request and execute all the required steps in order to make their favorite dish. But before we do big, complicated things like cooking in the real world, we'll need to start with even simpler manipulation tasks in household environments, like finding our way around, opening simple appliances and containers. And this is an example from the Alfred data set, which was built here at UW by Mohit Sridhar and Dieter Fox and team. But even a simple task, such as put the knife in the drawer, has a lot of moving parts. At the low level, you need to be able to recognize objects and plan paths between visible locations. And at the high level, we need to be able to reason about the long-term consequences of these really low-level actions. And this is like a real challenge for modern machine learning tools, because if you do not try to model any of the structure and just get 20,000 demonstrations and do behavior cloning by training a deep network policy to go from high-level goals and observations to low-level actions, this does not work at all. And clearly, this is a case where the structure important to solving this task doesn't emerge on its own in deep network policies, trained from scratch on this data. Now, a more effective approach might involve one model breaking the goal into these high-level subtasks, and another refining these into low-level actions. And while hierarchical agent architectures are well studied, they often require formalizing the domain symbolically or predefining a fixed inventory of skills, making them challenging to build even after decades of research. So we show how natural language can be used to parameterize and guide the discovery of a compositional library of skills. So representing skills as latent language gives us control over the skill set without having to pre-commit to a specific skill set or formal domain representation. So using data that mostly looks like this, goals and action sequences, I propose that we learn a hierarchical policy that looks like this, where we learn both the high-level policy as well as the low-level policy. And I describe how to train a hierarchical policy that reasons over sequences of high-level skills, parameterized by natural language strings, and show that these models can be trained very efficiently by treating language as latent and inferring the task structure and demonstrations jointly with model parameters. We also showed that priors from pre-trained language models can support sequential decision-making tasks. And our work was the first to use language models for reasoning about long-horizon sequential decision-making tasks in embodied environments. And this was pre-GPT-3 and pre-chain of thought. So this work is pretty old at this point of time. And just a couple of months after we published this work, so obviously in parallel, there was work that showed that bigger language models with clever prompting techniques can get you even crazier kinds of generalization. However, you had to assume that your low-level policies are fixed a priori, and the domain needs to align really well with the priors in the language model. And there's also more refined methods of the same approach that do this decomposition hierarchically with Google's language models. But once again, you had to assume that the low-level policies are fixed a priori, while no such assumption was required with SL cubed. So in conclusion, we saw that natural language could be used to parameterize and guide the discovery of a compositional library of skills, and how this could lead to better compositional generalization. And with that, zooming back out, and to put the three pieces together, we saw that there were smaller and more optimal transformers within larger transformers. We saw that the sperm whale communication system was a combinatorial coding system. And you could use language as a tool for thought for embodied systems, especially to reason about long-horizon reasoning and planning tasks. But really, all of this is just simply scratching the surface. And that brings me to future work. So today, we saw two types of systems. AI systems that are getting increasingly better at responding to complex queries on internet-scale information, and biological systems that are robust and adaptable and energy efficient, but have very specialized strategies to suit their environments. In both of these systems, we still lack a clear scientific understanding of their computational underpinnings and how we can bridge this gap. So in the long run, I want to build capable reasoning systems by engineering the right kind of structure that scales. So going forward in my research, I see the following path. So first, I really just want to understand what cannot be learned by scaling up current models and characterize the mistakes that do not go away with distribution matching alone. And how could this be fixed? So one approach to considering this question is considering whether solutions are currently expressible within models' current parameterization, and if so, they're actually learned during training. And can we better characterize the gap between expressivity and learnability of solutions within language models? I also want to see how we can enable scientific discovery guided by neural solutions, like we did in the case of the whale language model, but where the hypothesis space is much larger. I want to understand what powers the learning mechanisms across animals and explains the differences in their abilities to reason and communicate. And this requires doing a larger differential study across multiple species, right? But even before we can answer that question, we need tools that allow us to annotate the sounds of these animals and separate speakers and organize it into exchanges. So we've recently collected a really large database of over 1 million calls from 500 different species that even allow us to train such a model in the first place, and allows us to take like the first steps towards such a study potentially. I'd like to build a CS lab that works closely with groups in biology and neuroscience, and there's a lot CS can learn from these fields. Historically, that's been the case, and it's also been the case with my own research. I started my journey in AI with robotics. And even though I've spent a lot of time thinking about language and language-like structures and how they might lead to intelligent behaviors, I still think to really bridge this gap, we're going to need to learn from interactions. Interactions offer a unique form of supervision. They allow for systematic information gathering and help discover feasible states that the environment might be in and how it's possibly causally related. So how should information from lifelong interactions, physical or textual, be integrated into the learning process? And how can you continue to update your models when you have streaming non-stationary data? So in the long run, I want to build a unified understanding of complex sequential representation systems, like language, action sequences, genetic code, and thought. So all of these systems encode and transmit information at very different scales. But despite operating at very different scales, they have similar structures. They're compositional, hierarchical, productive, extensible. So what is really going on here? And of course, all of this can change as and when we are presented with new evidence. But the thing that really drives me is understanding the computational underpinnings of biological systems and engineering the computational underpinnings of AI systems. And with that, I'd like to thank all of my smiling collaborators on the projects I discussed today. And thank you all for listening.
All right, this is great. We have time for a couple of questions.
Thanks for the great talk. So in the first part, you mentioned like tree structures, compositionality, and these different aspects of these large language models. Did any of these transfer, for example, to the robotics kind of models you were training, or also even onto the language kind of models that you saw for whales?
Yes. So in some sense, like maybe these concepts as such, like transferred to the degree that in the case of whales, we saw this combinatorial coding system. But the models that we were training for the whale communication data specifically were really small because the amount of data we have is not that much. So to see these kind of structures emerge naturally in these systems was not something we saw from the get-go. And in the case of the robotics tasks, so one way to think about why pre-training, like why pre-trained language models maybe help transfer well to decision-making tasks is that maybe they, like in the course of training on language data, they learn to like build the right kinds of structures. And these kind of structures maybe also mirror the structure of the real world and maybe also like mirror the structure of demonstrations to some degree. Maybe there's this, obviously this kind of compositionality in long horizon sequential reasoning tasks. But we did not actually like try to approximate these models post-training or do any of these interventions. So we do not apply the techniques in part 1 to like techniques in part 3 as such. There's also chronologically, but yes. So I guess the concepts did reappear, and there were similar things that we kind of saw across the board, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for the great talk. Could you give an example of how would you engineer the structure within language model to make them better?
Yeah. So so I talked about some structures today, right? I talked specifically about low-rank structures, that when you impose low-rank structure post-training, you see these really large improvements in downstream task accuracies, right? And then I talked about tree-shaped computations, right? But these were structures that emerged naturally in these systems. So the kinds of structures that I'm interested in thinking about going forward are recursive structures. So transformers currently do not have an explicit mechanism to do recursive state tracking, right? And that's a class of functions that they just cannot learn. Like you cannot, a transformer model cannot learn a function that'll generalize to arbitrary lengths, and if it requires recursion, if it requires the model to build a recursive notion of state internally, right? So that's one kind of structure I'd like to think about. But interestingly, like so for example, RNNs, right, can build a notion of like recursive state tracking internally. But these models don't end up being as, they don't end up learning as well as transformers, right? So basically, how do you, engineer the right kinds of structures to increase expressivity of models so they can build these recursive state tracking mechanisms, but how do you also actually ensure that they actually end up learning some of these functions? So that's one thing I've been thinking about going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, very nice talk. Related to your whale language, so it seems like you've sort of expanded the vocabulary or of this language, or at least our understanding of it. But I was wondering how you actually validate that all of these different, 200 different symbols or whatever they are have meaning, because I think you could coordinate like a dive with very limited vocabulary, right? If that's sort of the only thing you do. And so I'm curious how you go about showing that, this language maps to going to dives to different depth, or I don't know exactly what the different behaviors would be that you need to look at.
Absolutely. So that's absolutely right. Currently, we've been looking at a very small set of behaviors, and we do not yet know the full extent of the semantic space that these calls of the whales really capture. But what we do know is that they can, in principle, encode and transmit information. And we see that by noticing these behavioral changes along with the structural tests that we did. We also saw that both of these new ways in which whales seem to be encoding information, like one is the rubato, it seemed to be imitated by the whales in the exchange, right? So we don't know what information it's encoding and transmitting, but we do know that there's a concrete behavioral response that we see from other whales in the exchange. Same thing for the ornament. So we don't know what it means. But we do know that every time there's an ornament, one of the whales either drops its stern or ends the conversation, or a new whale joins in, depending on where it occurs in the dialogue. So we see these behavioral effects of these additional features, but we are not totally sure exactly what the semantics of this extended vocabulary space might look like. And part of the reason is because we haven't really had a lot of behavioral data to go along with some of these calls, some of these audio recordings that we get. And part of the work going forward with Project SETI, which is the collaboration that gives us some of this data, is they're building sensors that also allow you to track the heart rate of the whale and so on and so forth. So going forward, we're going to get to see increasing amounts of behavioral data, and then hopefully maybe get to an answer to the question that you're asking.
Hi, great talk. I have a kind of a technical question about the laser part, and I guess related to a broader question. So you've really nicely shown, if you do the low rank approximation of these matrices after training, right, you see a great performance boost. I guess I'm curious, how much does this actually depend on the structure not existing during pre-training? So say, if the structure of low rank already exists during pre-training, would it be able to get to that performance? So that's the technical question. And I guess related to that, right, is you mentioned, about the scale and about the structure. So I guess depending on the question, the answer to that question, do you think maybe scale does need to exist before you impose structure, or can you already learn a really good model with structure in the very beginning?
Yeah. Okay. So to kind of get to the first part of your question, so can you train low-rank models that will already be as good as imposing this low-rank structure post-training? So the answer to that currently has been no. And what people have found is that over-parameterization helps with optimization. So even in the case of finding sparser subnetworks post-training, it's harder to train subnetworks from scratch. Although the lottery ticket hypothesis showed that post-training, once you figure out the right structure, then you kind of build models with that structure and initialize it to the original initialization weights, then you can train those models to be just as good. But for low-rank structures, people have not found such a thing, and people have tried to train inherently low-rank models from scratch. But now what could change, would be interesting to see, which we haven't tried, is if maybe at some point in the training, you could start to impose this low-rank structure earlier on, rather than have to wait up until end of training. So that's something that'll be interesting to see, but we haven't. And over-parameterization kind of helps with optimization, and that's what's seen with training sparser networks, and maybe that's also true to some degree with training low-rank systems. I guess the second part of the question, could you please repeat it one more time? Sorry.
Yeah, I guess it's the broader, more broadly speaking, the relationship between do you think you need scaling before imposing structure, right?
Yes. So It's not totally clear, and it's not totally true in all domains. So for example, in the case of the robotics task that I was talking about, we never really scaled up the amount of data we had before we imposed the structure. We imposed the structure from the get-go. So by constraining the latent space of the representation to be parameterized by all possible natural language strings, it kind of placed these constraints on the representation space that impose this kind of combinatorial structure in the representation, right? And that allowed learning these hierarchical policies more, that allowed making these hierarchical policies more tractable, right? So it's not totally true that you always need scale before structure, but yes, in the first two parts, the kinds of structures that we were talking about that were structures that emerged in the course of being trained at scale. But also in the first part, we saw that even though the structure emerged when models were trained at scale, there was still some benefit to imposing it post-training, right? So why is that? So it's not totally clear why, like further imposing that structure helped. Why did these models start to accumulate noise, or like why, in the course of training? So all of those questions are still not totally clear, but you don't always need structure before scale.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I have a couple of questions. The first on laser is, when you were building laser, did you test out other rank reduction methods for the latent representations? And then the second is on whale LM. I'm just curious, where did the intuition come from to break down the whale calls into, for example, you broke down the codas into 2 dimensions as opposed to just 1, and then you identified some of those features. So I'd just be curious where, maybe not so much on the computational side, but just from the intuitive side, where that intuition came from to identify those features and break down the codas in that way.
Absolutely. So in the case of laser, the other methods we also tried was to see if we do this kind of make the matrices selectively sparse. So instead of layer selective rank reduction, layer selective increase in sparsity. And we also saw that helped. Okay, so there's some discussion in this paper in the supplementary section. It didn't make it to the main paper because we did not test this as thoroughly and robustly as we did laser. But we did see that even if you were to, instead of unilaterally sparsifying your model post-training, if you do this more selectively, you do see improvements in the performance of your model. And interestingly, the improvements that you see by inducing sparsity post-training versus inducing low-rank structure post-training did not perfectly overlap. So there are some data points that you see more benefits on by inducing sparsity rather than low-rank structure. And I guess your second question was, how did we get this intuition for turning the clicks on their head and building like this plot? Yeah, so I think like the real reason was that at some point I wanted to, at the same time, be able to magnify into the structure of each call, be able to keep track of turn change, and look at things in the wider communicative context, so be able to look at longer sequences of time, right? But if you look at the old representation, which was just representing the clicks along one axis, the moment you zoom out, you don't actually see any of the structure in the calls, right? So to want to be able to do all these 3 things together, there's only one way possible, right? You have to turn one of them on its head so you can magnify into the structure while also keeping track of the other 2 things. So that's kind of where the intuition came from. But yeah, there's no more like of a specific story that I can recall, but it was roughly this. Okay.
All right, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much.